Hello, good morning. Thank you so much for joining me in my daily devotion. It's a wonderful morning. I hope you're having a busy and delightful morning. Friends, this week I would like to focus on God's will. I think the next few days we will talk about the elements of and all the nuances of what God's will is all about. This morning I would like to focus first on God's sovereign will. In Daniel chapter 4, verse 35, it says, He does according to His will among the hosts of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth, and none can stay His hand. In other words, there is nothing that happens that is outside of God's sovereign will. Try to let that absorb first at a moment, because that is far reaching. It is a deep theological discussion when we talk about God's sovereign will. But first things first, let's look at Bible verses to support the principle of God's sovereign will. It says in Psalms chapter 115 verse 3, our God is in the heavens. He does all that He pleases. He works. In Ephesians chapter 1 verse 11, he says, He works all things according to the counsel of His will. So everything happens according to God's will. Daniel 4 verse 37 says, all His works are right and His ways are just. Friends, when we talk about God's sovereign will, sometimes it's called hidden will. Why it is called a hidden will? Because sometimes we don't know it. Sometimes it has its curves, its peaks and valleys, and somehow we don't see exactly God's hand in everything that happens. And yet we have to learn to trust God and believe that He has a sovereign will for us. It is also called a decretive will because it involves God's decrees. It is hidden because we are usually unaware of this aspect of God's will until it really happens. But remember this, there is nothing that happens that is outside of God's sovereign will. Friends, let's talk about an example in the Bible regarding God's sovereign will. I'm sure you know the story of Joseph. Joseph was born second youngest in a family. Their father was Jacob, and he had 12 brothers. So 11 brothers, he was the 12th. And then there were instances in his life, that you could say that is it really God's will for him? He was a good man. He just loved God, he loved his family, he loved his father, and because he was young, he made a lot of, young mistakes. Being a youngster, he just blurts out whatever he feels. But he didn't deserve it. He didn't deserve the things that happened to him. First, he was sold as a slave by his own brothers. I mean, if that was not heartbreaking enough, his father found out and was told that he was killed by a lion, a wild animal. And they even showed to their father the coat of many colors that was drenched in blood. It broke his father's heart, thinking that his son was dead. Now, if you ask me, where is God's will there? Somehow, why is this young man who's supposed to have wonderful dreams suddenly cut short and put in as a slave? But the story doesn't end there. We know the story of Joseph, and the story is he was sold as a slave and he eventually became a slave under the captain of the guard in Egypt. And there he met a man named Potiphar. And the man named Potiphar was powerful, and he saw the potential of Joseph. He was a God-fearing man. He was a good man. He was good-looking, but he was very loyal to his master. And because of his character, Potiphar promoted him and put him in charge of his household. Can you imagine the life story of Joseph from a slave who probably had no future, probably expected a miserable life from their experience, a level of enhancement and elevation. He was promoted and he became captain. He became the head of the household of the captain of the guard of Potiphar. But his life didn't end there. His life from a slave to a manager was good, but then suddenly, a stroke of bad luck, the wife of Potiphar took an interest in Joseph. And because of that, she tried to seduce him. And when she tried to seduce him, eventually Joseph, because of his faith in God and his loyalty to his master, refused Potiphar's wife. And in the end, instead of being rewarded for his faithfulness and loyalty to his master, Potiphar put him in prison. So can you imagine, once again, where is the will of God there? Is his will good? How come if it's God's will and his will is good, how come he was faithful and yet he became a prisoner? He was put in prison for an injustice, no? Of a crime that he never did. He never raped nor took advantage of the wife of Potiphar. But in the end, friends, it's not even the end yet. So that's what happens. No, if you trust the will of God, the sovereign will of God, you have to go until the end of the story. Because eventually, years have passed. Probably he was drained of his life, drained of his goals, and he became I'm sure, probably depression came in his life as well. But in the end, we didn't know. That's not the end of the story, because Joseph had a gift. He can interpret dreams. And when there were two prisoners, one was a baker and when the one was a cupbearer, and then the baker had a dream, and then Joseph told him the dream, and the baker was killed. But the wine bearer, the cupbearer, Joseph interpreted the dream of the cupbearer, and eventually the cupbearer was released. And that cupbearer, even though it took him many years to realize, there was a time when the Pharaoh also had a dream that nobody could interpret. The cupbearer shared to the Pharaoh about someone that he knew way back when he was in jail. And eventually, Pharaoh called him, and when he called him in, asked him about his dream, and Joseph interpreted that dream and told him about the famine that was to come, and they needed to prepare themselves for the famine. And Pharaoh, because he was so impressed by this prisoner, put Joseph in command. He took out his ring and put it on his finger and said, "There is no other person in charge of the granaries except you." And so Joseph, the dreamer, from a slave to a prisoner, and now second in command, he was able to save not only Egypt, but he also saved his family. God used all the bad things that happened in his life. No, you can read it again in Genesis chapter 37 to 50. But we know that the brothers, no, they were ignorant of God's will. That's why it says hidden will of God, because people didn't know exactly what the will of God was. They were ignorant of God's will. Every step along the way, God's plan started to reveal itself. The story, friends, highlights how even seemingly negative events can be part of God's greater plan for good. I repeat, negative events can lead to God's greater plan for good. Ephesians chapter 1 verse 11 describes God as the one who what? He works all things according to the counsel of his will. It speaks of God's sovereign will. God himself expressed this fact in Isaiah chapter 46 verse 10. My purpose will stand, and I will do all that I please. Because God is sovereign, friends. He can never be frustrated. In other words, when you take a look at the world right now, God's sovereign will is still being revealed to the world even today. Now, I have a personal story to tell. Okay, this is my testimony. Like I remember ever since I was young, I always dreamt of myself as a lawyer. I watched all these TV shows about lawyers, and I wanted to be a trial lawyer. I wanted to be in debating and proving my point and winning my case. and I always dreamt about that. But somehow, I wasn't. There was a time when, of course, I think I took up 3 years in law school, but somehow life came, and eventually I had to let go of my dreams. And sometimes I ask myself, Lord, why? Why? I would have been a lawyer. I could have been a Christian lawyer and stood up for justice, no? And helped people that were unjustly wronged. But then somehow I ended up as a salesman. So instead of being a med rep, I was good in words and talking. So I became a med rep. So as a med rep, took me what, like a lot of years. And of course, I'm not complaining. It was one of the wonderful times, no, of my life. No, I met a lot of friends, doctors. Many of them were still starting out, and now they're accomplished doctors. So it was a wonderful experience. Bittersweet, yes, because somehow there was one time when there was a doctor. I don't know what happened, but he kind of didn't like what, somebody probably said something that, part of office politics. But my this doctor didn't want me to cover for him or her, and I was already in a senior position that time. But eventually, I was transferred to a place, and then I felt like I was being demoted, and I was demoralized. I said, Lord, what is this? What do you have in store for me? And that time, my children were still young. I didn't know if I could stay there or I look for another opportunity. But of course, that time I was already really seeking God's will. I said, Lord, what do you want me to do with my life? That was also the same time when I was very involved. I was very active in church, and I actually had a heart in ministry. In fact, there was one time that I was asked if I would be willing to pastor the church, and I said yes, yes. And then I quit my job, and I was about to accept this responsibility of leading a church. But then life came along, and there were some circumstances once again that didn't seem, no, there were like some obstacles in my mind, in my life. And I felt like, oops, Lord, is this your will? What's happening? So honestly, this is what you call hidden will. You don't really know the will of God. You don't know what God has in store for you. All you have to do is pray. All you have to do is read His Word, but sometimes it's not written in stone. So I thought I'm going to be a lawyer. Didn't turn out well. I thought I was going to be a pastor. It also didn't turn out well. Even though for me, that was what I wanted to do. Eventually, friends, I had to look for another job, and I was hired in another company. And that company, of course, it paid well, but it brought me outside my comfort zone. It brought me to a place. I was transferred in Pampanga, and I had to bring my family with me. And it was a difficult transition, I have to admit. I've always wanted to stay in Cebu. But because I was transferred there and had no other choice anymore, I eventually met a lot of people. I was there, and then I was exposed to different areas. Then after a year, I was transferred in another area closer to Cebu. But overall, I know that God's hand was starting to unfold in my life, because I just kept praying and saying, God, let your will be done in my life. Eventually, I was transferred back to Cebu, and then I met a lot of people, a lot of businessmen. And that's when I met someone who challenged me. Actually, not just me, but he challenged a lot of people also in that previous company that I was in. But I was one of those who really took that challenge, and I said to myself that I want to start my own business. And that business of mine was in 2009. I eventually took the step and resigned from my job in 2010. And 15 years after, right now, my company is 15 years old. And I have to say that was probably the most important decision I made when I did leave the corporate world and decided to be an entrepreneur. I didn't know how to do it. I only had a small idea. I didn't even have enough money to do it. But like I said, if you are doing the will of God, then you will know, because God's hand will just release openings and doors and opportunities and windows, that you will know that you are in the perfect sovereign will of God. It's been 15 years, friends, and I could say that my life has been changed, my family's life has been changed because of that decision. But you know what? like Joseph, it's not that yet the end. I don't know what's going to happen to my life. Life is still unfolding. And I know, who knows? God might use me in ministry. Who knows? God might use me in many things, as long as, like I said, I am open and I am just obedient to God's sovereign will. I believe in what Ephesians chapter 1:11 says. He works all things in your life according to the counsel of His will. So whatever you are experiencing, friends, if you feel like you are so far away from the Lord, first, you need to find out first if your heart is in is aligned with the Lord. Remember yesterday, you need to align your plans. You need to align your motives, and you need to align your actions. Because if you are not aligned with God yet, then how can you say you are in the will of God? So first thing, the will of God for you is to love Him and obey Him. You have to make that decision. Lord, I want to do your will. I surrender my life to you, and I just lift everything up to you, and you take the wheel. Remember the song, Jesus, Take the Wheel. Friends, it has to start there. And then in the end, like I said, I am not complaining. God has truly manifested His love and wonderful blessing upon my life. And I continue to remain hopeful, no? The next how many years God has in store for me, as long as I will do and I will be in God's sovereign and perfect will. Hallelujah. Friends, thank you so much for joining me. This is Bible Biker saying once again, I'll see you again tomorrow. Bye-bye.